everything.
Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Times Talk over DEI program bans and the future of DEI, presented by Grabbe, our Legal and Diversity Counsel. Thank you all for coming, and then I want to thank the library for their continued support. And this was made possible through the collaboration of SGA and AEP. And I'll give it over to Julie.
So there are those educators that without them you wouldn't be here today. So I want you to take a moment and bring those people to mind. I'm seeing a couple smiles on some faces, so I think some of you are doing that. So there are a few educators without whom I would not stand before you today. And I want to mention a few of them to you. In the 6th grade, Mr. Ellington, we called him Mr. E, introduced me to running. And I started in the 6th grade and I ran through so many emotions: anger, rage, frustration, depression, sadness, right? Running quite literally saved my life many times. And he introduced me to that. He saw that I needed something. He reached out. In high school, Mr. Kruger introduced me to music, and he spent more than the necessary time mentoring me, trying to keep me out of trouble and inactivities. I learned that music can change my mood. I learned it's a tool that I still use to this day to bring myself out of a funk. If I need to concentrate, if I need to motivate. Some of you have seen me around campus, and my car is often loudly thumping with EDM. That is my go-to. But he taught me that tool. And then I had Mr. Jesse Dixon and Mr. Jim Vance at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. And at the time, they were in what we call the American Ethnic Coordinating Office. And they brought me together with so many other students who were facing the same challenges as me, helping me navigate the technical and the personal aspects of the college, helping me build that community around myself. And those bonds are so strong, right, that 30 years later I still connect to those people that I met in we called it the AECO, the American Ethnic Coordinating Office. What they all have in common is that they created space for me to navigate huge emotional transitions inside of the learning environment. So for many of us, this is the only place that we're able to get tools or guidance to feel safe, to test and express new ideas and new thoughts, and to meet people that are different from us, right? I grew up in a town of 3,000 people, and so I was different from a lot of them, but also when I went to college, right, there was a whole levy of different people than me. So, there we go. I'm Julie Grabbe, and I am Legal and Diversity Counsel here at Fort Hays. I am not sure that my office number is correct, just FYI, but I am in Fishley Wills and in Sheridan across from Joe Bain's office. So my position is a little bit of a hybrid. It's different than what any of the other universities are currently doing here in Kansas. I assist with review of university policies, procedures as it relates to legal compliance. I do the boring part of my job, which is legal contract review. And then I'm the Chief Diversity Officer, so I'm responsible for university-wide DEIB initiatives, programming, what that might look like for faculty, staff, and student success. So, I wanted to say those people's names because they really understood and embraced diversity and inclusion. They reached out, and some did it with titles and offices, and some did it without. So in the 80s and 90s, right, diversity meant something different than it does today, and certainly we are at a point where we're going to need to adapt and change with the evolution of our populations, our laws, and our goals, right? So what I'm going to go through today is briefly just diversity definitions, the current status of DEI legislation. I'll cover several different states, DEI legislation specifically in a couple of the surrounding states from Kansas, what's on the board for Kansas, and some common themes throughout that, and then DEIB and the Kansas economy. So we're going to look at like the jobs outlook, and we'll go through that information, and then what's next for DEIB. So diversity, when we say diversity, what is it that we seek? What is it that we need? So when we talk about the legislation that's passed in several of these different states, be aware that all of these states have defined diversity differently, right? right? We have, every institution will define it differently, every legislator, every law will include a different definition. One of the definitions that I like is that we're making sure everyone feels valued and welcome no matter where they come from or what they look like. It's pretty simple. The LPA, the Legislative Posada, gave us a definition for activities and services that the university provides to support students who may not have had the same opportunities to succeed as others. And then Fort Hays gives us characteristics of diversity on their website, and it's very broad, as it should be. And we talk about age, cognitive style, culture, disability, economic background, right? All of those things encompass diversity and really who we are. There you go. So current legislation, here's kind of a map of current legislation. That dark blue is bills introduced or approved, the light is no bills, and the red is on watch. So there are currently more than 30 bills across the U.S. targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at public universities. As of January 31, 7 of them have been signed into law. We have 2 in Florida, 1 in South Dakota, 1 in North Dakota, 1 in Tennessee, 1 in Texas, and most recently 1 in Utah. So the rest, I think, are waiting final approval and are moving through legislation. So, of the laws that have passed thus far, these are the states that have passed them. We have Florida, Senate Bill 266 and House Bill 931. I am going to briefly go through them so you can kind of hear the themes that are coming out of them. But public institutions in Florida are prohibited from funding the promotion, support, or maintenance of DEI programs, and from offering any general education course that teaches identity politics or is based on theories that systemic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent in the institutions of the United States. State public institutions are prohibited from giving preferential consideration in employment, admission, promotion. That's a recurring theme that you're going to hear, based on race or ethnicity. South Dakota has House Bill 1020. Yes. It targets divisive concepts, but doesn't restrict professors from teaching the subjects. Instead, it prohibits mandatory trainings or orientation about these concepts. And I'll go over divisive concepts on it. It's still in slide. North Dakota has Senate Bill 2247. And they are asking that students, professors, other employees of higher education cannot be asked about their ideological or political viewpoints. Also, they can't conduct mandatory training that includes specified concepts. And they give an example, like the belief that an individual, by virtue of their race or sex, is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. Tennessee has House Bill 1376. Students and employees can report professors who teach divisive concepts at their institutions. They've also introduced a prohibition requiring DEI training and education in medical and health-related degrees and using state funds to endorse or promote divisive concepts. That one is still pending. Texas has SB 17 and House Bill 5127. This is going to prohibit DEI offices themselves. So it also prohibits diversity training for students and employees and ideological oaths and statements. That began January 1, 2024. They did not restrict academic research and coursework in Texas. And then also the institutions in Texas actually have to file a compliance report, like certifying that they are not doing these things. Senate Bill 16 bans critical race theory teaching at the university level in Texas. And House Bill 1 is, I think, in final legislative approval. It bans DEI practices and programs that don't comply with the state constitution. So that's sitting, I think, on a desk for approval. And finally, Utah has 261, which is eliminating training requirements that promote differential treatment, prohibiting race taking into account for hiring practices, and prohibiting the DEI offices again. So you can hear a couple of kind of recurring themes there. So what are our neighbors doing? Okay. Nebraska has Senate Bill 283. They've introduced that and moved it to a legislative research study. And they're wanting to prohibit diversity, equity, inclusion offices and officers at public institutions. Missouri Senate Bill 410, prohibiting institutions from requiring faculty, staff, students, right, to answer questions about their ideologies surrounding DEIB, and if they are found in violation, they risk losing funds, grants, and other contracts. Senate Bill 75 was introduced to prohibit institutions from requiring students to engage in any mandatory gender or sexual diversity training or counseling. And SB 680-1196 is eliminating diversity statements in hiring at public universities. Oklahoma has 870 and 1008 prohibiting the funding of DEI offices and using what they've termed political tests and diversity statements in the hiring process. And Colorado isn't. So that's what our neighbors are doing. Currently in Kansas, we have HB 2460. No post-secondary educational institution shall request or require a pledge of allegiance or statement of support for or against any political ideology or movement, including a pledge or statement regarding DEI, patriotism, or related topics. So for students, this means we can't condition admission or educational aid on that, and for faculty, that means, you know, faculty, staff, hiring, promoting, reappointing, tenure, all of that. And then I got an update this morning, this morning, on what has been introduced as a proviso in the Senate. And what they are suggesting is that, did I print it? So they're requiring that the president of the university provide a statement that we are not requiring diversity statements in hiring, that we will not require any DEI training, and if there is a failure to comply, the state will take $35 million in total allocated funding to the universities from the state general fund, which amounts to 5% of each of our state general fund money for each university. Our understanding is that Keyboard does not currently support that proviso, so we will watch and see what happens, but that is currently the newest legislation that's come down the pipe. So common themes here, right? There's about 7 that I can point out. There's, of course, some outliers, but one is the ideological oaths and political viewpoints when hiring or promoting or admitting. What does this mean? So these kinds of prohibitions are aimed at things like diversity statements. So many institutions ask a potential hire to describe their commitment to diversity or their experience with working with people from diverse backgrounds, describe their commitment to equity or inclusion goals at the university or classroom level, and they're saying this is requiring people to ascribe to a certain political identity or viewpoint, and that is not allowed. Preference because of race or ethnicity, or because of preference because you support DEIB efforts. So that is basically, as it's stated, giving someone a preference in hiring admission because of race or ethnicity only, or because they say they support DEIB. In practice, I don't know that this actually occurs. I think that when hiring committees are looking at hiring, they're looking at the whole package and who the most qualified candidate is. So that being said, that's a theme. Prohibition on course content. So we are in the United States currently prohibiting courses or teaching on identity politics, critical race theory, systemic anything, so systemic racism, sexism, oppression, privilege, that we're not allowing that to be taught in some courses in some states. Now, there are some laws in some of the states that specifically exempt academic research and exempt coursework to avoid the appearance of censorship, which I think is an issue. Fourth, we're prohibiting DEI offices, so places that have an office solely for the purpose of DEI. Those are going to come under scrutiny, I think. And then, or they are under scrutiny. Prohibit taking race into account in hiring practice. So we've already had some case law come down, if you've been paying attention, talking about using race as a factor when going through the hiring process, when it is allowed to be used, when it is not allowed to be used. And so that is a prohibition that they are legislating. And again, case law has already come down and kind of clarified that. Prohibits use of state funds for DEI programs and training, and to endorse or promote divisive concepts. So basically, if you're going to use any state funds for any DEIB trainings or any of the concepts that they have termed divisive, they're going to pull those funds. And then prohibiting mandatory training around DEI concepts. And this can be for employees, faculty, staff. This can be for students. And what we've seen so far is they're prohibiting trainings around privilege by way of race or sex, conscious or unconscious bias, gender or sexual diversity, and again, those divisive concepts. So what the heck are divisive concepts? So this is actually from the Middle Tennessee State University. Some of the more interesting ones are up here, and you can read. There's quite a few on the list. They actually have to publish these according to their statute. So this is published on the Middle Tennessee State University's website. It lists quite a few. Some are superfluous because I think nobody is really doing some of the things that they're prohibited from doing again. Some of these things are repeated themes that we see over and over again, and then some of them are just kind of interesting. So I'll let you take a minute to read those. I found this one particularly interesting because it begs the question, who gets to decide what a divisive concept is? So I'm going to switch topics a little bit, and I'm going to transition from our discussion on the current legislative landscape surrounding diversity in education, where we've seen this trend towards restricting funding, restricting support for DEIB programs and initiatives, and we're going to pivot to consider economic and educational forecasts for Kansas over the next decade. So the Kansas Board of Regents commissioned a report from the KU Institute for Policy and Social Research, looking at jobs and degree requirements for 2030, and they were considering the supply and demand of graduates from KBOR institutions, comparing rates of migration in and out of Kansas, and evaluating the demand for Kansas occupations that require degrees. So, supply and demand are figured by the KBOR reporting on retention of graduates with degrees in Kansas, along with the projections of 10-year expected labor demands based on Bureau of Labor Statistics and Lightcast data. So from 2020 to 2030, and that's when all of these numbers are going to be 2020 to 2030, it's looking at that 10-year time period. Kansas will add 54,000 jobs that will require a degree, and it gives you the breakdown of what kind of degree. Most are bachelor's or higher, and that's where those numbers come from. This is the 10-year change in jobs requiring a degree between 2020 and 2030. So you can see Kansas in the middle in there at 54,000 jobs. So we have the second smallest increase in comparison to surrounding states. So Oklahoma has 73,000, Iowa 84,000, Missouri 109, Colorado 203, and Texas you can see 1,100. So job openings. So from 2020 to 2030, 180,000 workers with jobs requiring the degree will be exiting the labor force. And this is a breakdown of what level of degree, but as you can see, I rounded up to 180, it's 179, 873. 180 will exit the labor force. So when we take a look at the math of 54,000 new jobs being created and 180,000 jobs opening up due to exit, we get a demand of 235,000 jobs requiring a post-secondary degree. So who's going to fill these spots? So new graduates are going to fill these spots, right? Imports will fill these spots. And so we take a look at our new graduates and our retention rates, our 10-year retention rates. And it appears that the higher the degree, the lower the retention rate. Kansas retains fewer than half of its bachelor's degree holders after 9 years of graduation. Kansas exports students to Texas, Missouri, Colorado, and Illinois. And our out-migration rates are highest for adults 20 to 35 with bachelor's degrees. We do have in-migration or importing of the same age group. in part due to people moving across the KC metro area. But overall, there are more moving out than moving in, so we're at a deficit. The expectation is that we will have 200,000 new graduates who will stay and work in Kansas over that 10-year period. What's that mean? When we math, we have a 200,000 supply, a 234,000 demand, and we are in a deficit of 34,000 people. So we must produce 34,000 additional degrees to meet the demand in this 10-year period. So let's talk about how those two topics are actually connected. It turns out Kansas is going to have a lot more jobs than it has people to do those jobs. And that might sound like a good problem to have, but it's kind of like having a soccer team with not enough players. It is not ideal if you want to win the game. So the decisions we make today regarding DEIB and education will directly impact our ability to meet the state's economic and workforce challenges tomorrow. While the current legislative environment poses a challenge to DEIB efforts, I think it also highlights an opportunity and a chance for us to reassess and reinvigorate our approach to education and workforce development. I think the DEIB initiatives play a critical role in workforce development. By fostering that inclusive and supportive educational environment, we enhance the student and faculty recruitment and also the retention. Diverse perspectives and inclusive policies contribute to a richer, more engaging educational experience, which in turn improves our graduation rates, better prepares students for the workforce. Our commitment to DEIB makes our institution more attractive to a broader range of students and faculty, and I think that's very important. If we continue to do the same things that we have done, we are going to continue to get the same numbers that we are getting, and it is not enough. So we need to broaden our range, broaden our perspective, and expand that talent pool and increase the likelihood of us meeting Kansas's workforce needs. So to me, DEIB, we ask ourselves the question, where is DEIB going? DEIB is not just about fulfilling a moral imperative. This is about ensuring long-term economic vitality and competitiveness for Kansas. And we are in an increasingly global landscape. We have to have that to survive, to thrive. And we don't want to just survive, right? We want to thrive. I think that there are certain challenges that are coming down from the legislature. Whether that's new or not, I think we've always kind of faced challenges and a changing landscape there, and we've adapted and we've changed and we've innovated. And I think that's what we're going to continue to do. I have faith that the Mr. E's and the Jessies and the Jims of the world are still going to be around and doing what they do, reaching out inclusion, whether they have the office or not. I also think that at this point in time, our diversity and our inclusion efforts are more ingrained inside our institutions than they used to be, where we used to have simply one person that was responsible for a diversity initiative and they did all of the things. We are moving toward a model where we are integrating this throughout and making it part of the fabric. And so that's where I think DEIB is going. I think there will probably be some challenges along the way, but I do think this is something that I think the colleges are going to adapt, the staff is going to adapt, faculty is going to adapt, students are going to adapt. We are going to figure out a way to make DEIB still a part of this fabric and still make our students and our faculty connected and succeed. So I appreciate everybody coming today so much. I wasn't sure if anybody would be super interested in this topic, but I'm so glad you did. I'm willing to open it up to questions if anybody has any. But that's for that. Yeah, hey Chris.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you for coming.
My question is with the Kansas proposals, with respect to the DEI training aspect, how do they approach it considering the fact that a lot of, well, all the institutions within Kansas need to be accredited, and the accrediting body, Higher Learning Commission, requires a diversity component, and you would think diversity training is a part of meeting that standard. And then some specific degree programs, like in education, are accredited by a specialized body that necessitates some diversity training. So how can we go about achieving accreditation, meeting accreditation standards, if we're not having DEI training?
Right. So I think that poses an interesting question of, right, the fight between what we're legislated to do and what we need to do to stay accredited or to have certain, degrees conferred upon us, whatever. Two things there. One, the law is like sausage and you don't want to see it being made. It's messy, and I think that a lot of times those things are the things that get tested, right? If they don't do a good job of writing it, if there's questions with two competing requirements, how they are going to address that, and that could be resolved in a number of ways. One, they could write that in. I know that a lot of the legislation has written in, there is an exemption if you are required to do this for Higher Learning Commission accreditation, to maintain your accreditation. KBOR has, goals for universities in Kansas that include us tracking our student populations and by race, by sex, right? And those are things we're still going to be allowed to do. But I think it does become really interesting how that plays together. And of course, I can't tell you what they're thinking when they come down with the laws that they write and the bills that they propose. But that's what I would say, is that I think a lot of them have written in exemptions. And then as far as what was recently proposed, like last night or this morning, it was last night I think, with regard to the proviso with that $35 million, I don't believe KBOR is supporting that. So that is one thing that is a boon for us, I guess. Yeah.
How much of the state's educational funding is either directly or indirectly federal? And because I'm just thinking of how the drinking age was 18 until the federal government mandated that if you wanted to receive federal highway dollars, it had to be 21, because we used to have a bar in the dorm on campus. So, what kind of implication would there be for the state universities if they're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I think that kind of takes you back to federal versus state law, right? Federal is always going to trump state law. It might cause a few lawsuits. Typically, the law is written to exempt universities from not following federal mandates. So that's typically in there. So anything that we need to do pursuant to federal law, that's already exempted. As far as specific dollars, I can't tell you specific dollars off the top of my head for federal, related DEIB funding. There was recently an audit for state funding. I don't have the results yet, but it is coming. So.
But that was just something I thought about. I didn't expect you to have an answer.
Sorry, I can't talk very well. Most of the federal dollars that we get are tied to financial aid.
Okay.
So, and that would be a significant hit for this campus.
That's an understatement. That would end this university.
Yes.
So if it comes to that, Kansas will not be the tip of the spear, but if the federal government ever chooses to use that tool, it would be a powerful.
Anybody else?
We're seeing lots of tests going on now in many of those states on your map that have already passed the laws.
So, yeah, most of the states are actually still, they're pending, they're going through the legislature, they're going through the process. So I didn't look up case law yet on any of the ones that have already passed. They're fairly new, and sometimes that can take a while to get through. That would be an interesting update, though, at looking at what kind of lawsuits get filed and what those look like.
With your summary, it sounds like Florida overall is the most restrictive. Is that about right? Or
Well, I feel like,
might be an interesting state to watch, I guess.
yeah, I think overall this is an interesting issue to watch, right? I just think that the focus is really, really heavily on a DEI office or a DEI training without really thinking about what that gives our students, what benefit that gives our faculty and our staff, how, to break it down individually, how it helps you as an individual person succeed in the school, such is the way of laws, I guess. Yeah.
And it's certainly appropriate, I think, to distinguish different groups at universities, people who get hired and then students who get admitted there. And I know people are doing the studies on this. I don't know all the data, but one of the things that helps support this, DEI programs is, well, you can say your students want it. The students you have, and then your prospective students. This is where you say, look, if we don't do this, we're going to have reduction in the number of students, and even legislatures can pay attention to something like that. They don't probably pay as much attention in many states to what administrators at a university or professors say, but they will probably pay more attention to the people who actually come to the schools. And if you show that we're going to have this % drop more, we're going to see that in some of these schools. Maybe some of the states will get there before us, and they'll have the bad news to say, yeah, we went down in admissions because we implemented these policies, and the students didn't want that. I saw a debate recently from the co-founder of FIRE, and with an individual who was pushing back, and one of the things he said was that the students don't think they want, when you poll the students, they don't say they want less DEI schools, they want more. And that was probably his strongest rebuttal to the arguments the other individual was making about freedom of expression, and that he thought that there were ways in which these programs restrict that, and you have a kind of cancel culture. And he pointed to more professors have been fired due to their political speech or something like that since the McCarthy era, which is statistics were a little skewed because you've got a lot more people at schools now. If you're just doing raw data, you need to see percentages there rather than just, the number of cases is more than it was in the 50s. I would think it'd be a whole lot more regardless of what people were doing, just because the numbers are so much greater.
Right. And the way some of these things get defined too, like a diversity statement. Are you really asking someone to subscribe to an ideology, or are you simply asking them, how are you going to make every single student in your class make it through your class and succeed so that we can keep them going, get them graduated, right? So, yeah, I appreciate that perspective.
I feel like all the ways that Fort Hays has succeeded at a scale that's recognizable to state representatives and beyond have been by taking all of the things that they're demonizing and replacing the words race and sex and gender with traditional students or urban students, rural students versus urban, or 18-year-olds versus 30-year-olds. And so we are essentially a living laboratory of success of quote-unquote diversity, but just without those charged words of gender and race. So if we're going to stop doing this for gender and race, we should probably stop treating rural students and online students different than those that were growing up in Johnson County. And that's completely ridiculous.
Right.
Or having special programs for military connectedness.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
you're treating
That's
a
diversity.
certain group
Yep.
as
Or
giving them
inclusion,
special
right?
treatment.
Yeah.
Your logic is very sound.
Yeah.
Thank you, from a philosophy professor. I'll take that.
Write that down.
Hey, so I know I'm late, sorry, class teaching responsibilities, and I missed the overall, but I'm piecing things together. And, for me, I have a few years of experience here, and I think these are enough years separated that I can speak to, like I said, enrollment issues and stuff like that. So, for instance, my first round here, I had several students that were, at that point in time, CAM students, and they were associated with certain groups on campus, underrepresented groups. And there's just the fact that the people of color that are on campus that are representative, we take on additional roles because we're absorbing those students. When they find that we'll listen to them, that we're going to be that representative ear, that shoulder, like they sat in my house and they've been on my couches and they play with my kids and my dogs. Like I know, but interestingly enough, those are very quantifiable issues as far as enrollment. I can think of 3 right off the top of my head that says, I'm not going to the university here. I live Kansas here, and I don't want to go to school here. It was horrible, their experience, and some of the things they dealt with. And granted, that period of time within that 2-year window was very hostile, but I can't say we're not about to do it again, to be quite frankly honest. And so that creates, again, the issues where if they don't feel welcomed here because people don't want to use the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're squeezing them out more and more and more. There's been students that transferred for the same exact reasons and that still stay in contact with me. They're like, hey, I'm thriving out here in Lincoln, or I'm thriving out here. And so I'm like, man, I do miss you, but I'm so glad to see that you are able to finish what you started and the place that you feel included. Because ticking the diversity box is cool, but if the inclusion isn't there and you can, there's not a lot groups can do. Inclusivity comes from person to person and stuff like that. But I will say from the being in a state that it feels like, I was Spanish Florida, for instance, that it feels like they're just ice picking away at these things, it does impact the person, because it's like, man, does my identity mean nothing? Like, I really just feel like one day it's just gonna be like a free-for-all. And again, I'm almost 40. I have my own, I have full development in my frontal lobe, my awareness of who I am is strong, and it still eats away at me. So if I am like 18, 19, and I'm not fully developed and not even strong in who I am, just imagine how that kind of thing deters, our students, and that's hard to watch. That's hard to watch. So.
I think you bring up a good point too, like the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? We can tick the box of diversity, and someone else said this to me, diversity is a thing that we have. We already have it, right? I'm diverse from you, you're diverse from him. We're diverse, we all come from different backgrounds, we've got different things that we experience. We have that, we have diversity. Inclusion is a thing we do. And I think we have to do a better job. I don't want to lose students or faculty or staff to other universities. That impacts, how well we can provide an experience here. So, thank you.
Julie?
Yeah.
How much of these efforts can be linked to anti-DEI interest groups? And is the messaging that they are conveying just much more persuasive than interest groups that are in favor of DEI initiatives?
I don't know that I can really speak to that. I don't have a lot of expertise there. I did do a little digging when I was looking at, this DEI wave of legislation kind of came at the same point. Yeah. I think it originated from a paper that was written, and I can't remember the name of the I think it was 2 groups that coordinated on it, and they had distributed that to their proponents who wanted to look at changing DEI legislation or ending DEI legislation. It's my understanding that a lot of what is in that paper has ended up on books in different states. So to answer that question, I don't know how much of it can be traced back to certain interest groups. I would say that almost any piece of legislation is traced back to an interest group. I mean, that's kind of how our politics works today, right? We have interest groups for, we have interest groups against. And whose voice is the loudest right now? Right?
One of the things I've seen, Chris, is the fact that it comes down to that argument of logic versus emotion, and you can never win an argument with emotion, even if you're sounding your logic, because a lot of times any opposition, regardless of which side you're on, is very emotionally invested in their views, but it's based on the fact that they feel like it's a zero-sum game. Like, I can't win if you're winning, and that's the fallacy. That's a bias of thought. Because just because this group is, it has a group that acknowledges them doesn't mean you're not equally as acknowledged. Just trying to play, from a different position. Like, our military students can't not win because of our black students are being promoted here. Like, who said that that's what that meant by any extent? But there are people that are taking that idea and are running with it, right? Like, we don't care about our rural white students because we're focused on our minority students. But that's asinine. Like, who thinks that? People, but they do. That's the problem. They actually really fully believe it with their, I would say heart, but I'm a scientist, opposite their brain. They really believe that with their brain. So it's troubling. I mean, again, you can use all your stats, your logic in the world, but when their heart brain is in there, they dug in.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, with these bills being introduced, how it's going to impact student organizations. I know we're talking about how it's affecting faculty and finances, but our student organizations such as HALO, GSA, BSU, are those going to be considered divisive concepts?
Here's what I have to say about this, and it kind of goes back to what Brady said. if GSA is considered a divisive concept, if BSU is a divisive concept, if Halo is a divisive concept, then so is our groups connected with the military, right? If we're gonna circle someone out because of a particular characteristic and they're gonna legislate that this has to go away, then they kind of have to say that everything has to go away. Are we supporting our non-traditional 30-year-old plus students in a different way than we're supporting our 18-year-old students? If we're gonna get rid of certain affinity groups, I think that puts on the table getting rid of all affinity groups. And I don't, as a practical matter, see that happening. I think maybe some people would like to see that happen and would like to pick and choose and see what would happen there maybe, but I don't think it makes sense logically, and I don't see that coming down the pipe. I understand the fear though, I do. Yeah,
Well, I mean, a couple
absolutely.
of years ago, we had the, it was tunnels of oppression.
Sure,
Like,
I recall hearing about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see that getting a lot of pushback if we try to have something of that nature now.
When you say pushback,
I mean, I see it getting, I just feel like people aren't going to be happy and
Well-
going to be more vocal about it.
People are never happy.
I think that, here's the thing with diversity,
Your
right?
perspective.
Here's the thing with diversity, right? You have a perspective over here that's gonna be opposite from a perspective over here. If you just have one perspective, that's not diversity, right? Marvin Cruz said that to me, right? You gotta remember that diversity means both sides of that issue. And so, yeah, somebody's gonna get upset when this group does something, somebody's gonna get upset when this group does something. The issue is, are we including and making you a space where you feel like you are able to still learn here, you're accepted here, right? Your freedom of speech, your freedom of expression is still maintained. So, I mean.
And if you want to do something like that, because I went through it a couple years ago, I mean, I'm sure Julie and I would be very happy to work with you on how do you promote it and make sure that, because somebody's always going to be against something, or my job wouldn't exist, right? Like, how do we make sure that you get to do it in a way that you're showing the intent of educating people on different experiences and not indoctrinating them in an ideology? And that there's ways to do that. I mean, we talk about this stuff all the time.
As long as it's not required
Yeah.
as part of anybody's employment or grade or something, I think you have a lot of leeway there still. I'd like to go back to Chris's question about where this comes from. My perspective only, this is just my opinion from my observation. There was no problem being solved here. The state of Kansas did not have a significant volume of citizens saying, we would like to fix this problem. This is a very small group of state legislators who thought, what a great idea, from external groups and other states. This is a way they can get recognized for re-election or seek higher office and have notches in their belt. So nobody's going to follow up with most of the minor conflicts at our university. Now, if we choose to be responsible and like shove this in people's faces and put our thumbs in their eyes to win points on your side, whatever that is, then yeah, maybe expect a lawsuit. But don't do that. I mean, if you're behaving in good faith and trying to educate people for healthy, honest reasons, nothing's changed. But if you were just teaching a DEI course so that your CV made you look like a particular sort of person, then maybe you should question why you were doing that. So it's not the sky's not falling.
Right, right.
Under the current laws and policies of Kansas, if a department, say, needed to hire an employee, an administrator, a chair, and the department decided that, well, we don't have any diversity, we have no ethnic, racial diversity in our department, and on top of that, we see having someone like that in our department would very likely draw new students into our program that wouldn't otherwise be interested. Would it be unethical, not unethical, but would it violate a policy or a law to make that part of the search criteria, that the person was had a certain ethnic background?
I think that if you are, I think that if you are looking at it specifically from a certain ethnic background, I think you're going to run into trouble. I think that if you are
Even though the
looking,
purpose of it was to address inequality and the fact that we don't have diversity in that area here, it would still be against the, it would not be permitted to do that.
I would not advise it for using it as a hiring criteria just from what's coming down the pipe, okay? I think that you can ask a person about their diverse experiences and how, you know, they are allowed to, according to certain case law, right, that just came down. They can still explain to you how race has affected their life and how that's made their viewpoint or their teaching or whatever it is better, worse, and different, okay? But using it as specifically as a criteria, we're going to look for a black faculty member because we know it's going to attract black students, for example, right?
And it's going to make our faculty more representative of the population.
Which would be a quota-based thing. So I would say that is, that is not the way to go. Because that is what they are currently cracking down on, is legislation that is looking at quotas, any sort of number situation as far as we want this to reflect the population, right? We want our numbers here to reflect the same percentages that are in the population. So that is currently what's being cracked down. I think the way to understanding that would maybe bring, right, additional students, additional perspectives in. A way to look at that is honestly the DEI program, I think, is great at that. Expanding that search, taking a really hard look at our hiring and hiring practices, our job descriptions, what those look like, the process itself, whether there's any pieces of the process that are perhaps excluding people unintentionally. But using race specifically as a criteria to hire, I think, is a
So
no.
if you can't use race as a criteria,
You can't
there's
use
really no purpose in even monitoring that. Can you tell me, for example, what percentage of our department chairs are male, what percentage are white, and what percentage are of alternative sexual identity?
I don't know if I could do chairs, but there is data on.
Can you do the?
I think I can do faculty staff. I mean, I can't
Can
off
you
the
do
top
the
of my head.
deans? Can you tell me that for the deans?
Not off the top of my head. I don't know that we keep stats, deans, chairs.
Well, if we don't keep track of what our diversity is, how can we have any idea about how to go about addressing it? Is it any wonder there's no diversity here?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the big things, right? Is what do we have? Do we know what we have?
Obviously,
Right?
we don't.
Well, I don't think we have
Other
it
than
broken
casual
down.
observation.
Yeah, I don't think we have it broken down to.
All of our deans are white, right? And
I don't
probably,
know.
I would guess, 95% of our chairs, at least, if not 100. I don't know of any non-white chairs.
Don't say, but
Oh, you can name one.
I know, exactly. That was to make your point even stronger.
Yep. Yeah.
So to your point, though, that's a great question. A few years ago, as part of the strategic plan, Arvin also doesn't want to be included in white, so I should throw him in there as another chair. Point is, we don't know. We've done a poor job. We do have aggregate data at the university level, and they are broken down by some really unhelpful HR classifications as opposed to things
Yeah,
like
it's like class.
dean or chair
Yeah.
or whatever. So there are some data there, but they are inferior at best. And that was one of the primary recommendations on the strategic plan for this group that was tasked with goal 3.3, was to figure out what we have, like you just said very well. So I'm reinforcing your points. I'm not challenging you or giving you any helpful answers other than to say that you are on the right track. Keep asking those questions.
And that is actually
Well,
one
it
of the
just
things that.
suggests there's no sincere effort to try and address it, because that looks like that would be the first step.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think figuring out what we have is the first step. So figuring out how we get the funding to figure out what we have, right, is my challenge right now.
I wouldn't say there are no sincere efforts. I'm might say. There have not been any greatly successful results, but the efforts are ongoing.
We don't have much control over the diversity of our students, not like we could have over our faculty. And so, you know, we don't have a very diverse student population. There's not a whole lot we can do about that. And so all we can do is expose those students to some diversity in the faculty and staff. That's the only way they're going to get exposed to diverse people, is if there's some way to force it on them. And as long as we have a reputation, all of our staff and faculty, or most of them are white, well, that's naturally going to attract people that want to go to an environment that's all white. And those are the very people that need exposure to diversity. So I don't know, is that a catch-22, or if it is, yeah, that suggests that it'll never be solved, not in the current way of addressing it. So somebody could do that sort of, you know, not officially, but if you got together and agree, well, yeah, we need some diversity, and you could, even though you're not explicitly choosing people for that reason, you could, right? If you really wanted your department to be diverse, you wouldn't have to say, well, you don't have to say we're looking for a black person or a Hispanic person, but you could sort of informally show preference towards candidates that.
You're going to get the same legal answer from me that I gave you the first time, which is no. If
think there is a
that's the
related
only,
metric.
if that's the only thing, right?
That would be worth knowing. And is the sort of thing is like, is there a trend? Because, you know, the one thing that might give you some hope is, this is from a book I used to teach in class, Factfulness. Things can be bad but better. So even if you think, well, we're not as diverse as we'd like to be, are we more diverse than we used to be? And what we're doing, is it getting it? Well, the answer could be no to that, but you need the metric, you need the data to say, have we hired more, do we have a greater percentage of, you know, non-white male faculty than we used to have?
But I just want to say,
Or whatever you
it's not out of
frame it.
it's not out of the question that the most qualified person for your position would be a person of color.
Right.
So, I mean, I think we're pretending like we would only hire for color if we wanted somebody. Doesn't mean that the person of color isn't the most qualified person for that position.
Yeah, I would say the problem with that is if you have discrimination in education, you're going to have a smaller pool of potential minorities with PhDs, and those people are naturally going to want to go to the places that are more diverse. And so you're going to have trouble with people even applying
Or that pay more, right?
places.
Because Kansas doesn't pay rates. I mean, it's multifactorial, right? We have so many pieces that fit into this puzzle on why we're not getting candidates, why we don't have hires.
Well, I would add why because the data I've seen shows that Kansas is losing college students to other states. Other
Yes.
states are going, do these legislators have any idea or any suspicion that what they're doing here is actually what's causing professors, the good professors, not to want to come here, and the students want to go where the good professors are? Do they see any link between these oppressive ways, limiting what we can teach in the classroom, and the loss of students that we're experiencing? If that's true, this is only going to make it worse. These new things are coming, they're only going to make it worse.
Is that their goal?
And then where are they going to recruit from?
I hope their
What
goal
people
is
are
not
they
to
hoping
lower our
attract here?
college.
If they're going to, like, if there's a segment of the population, they are kind of putting up barriers, how are they hoping to fill those spots? You know, who is going to do the work? Fill those jobs you talked about? Yeah.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I've got her standing behind me like I think it's time. I appreciate everybody that came out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julie, for having this conversation, and I encourage all of you to continue asking these thought-provoking questions outside of here. Continually be civically engaged. Continue talking to your legislators. Call them up. That's their job. And continue having these conversations, because this is how we breed civic engagement on campus, in our community, and here in Kansas. But again, thank you so much for this amazing time talk. Thank you to SGA for the collaboration with ADP, and thank you to the library for their continued support. And thank you to all of you for coming out and supporting. So have a great rest of your days, and I hope you enjoyed this time talk.